Welcome back everyone, it's me Matt, thanks for joining me today. So the Challenger 2 main battle tank, many of you know I'm a bit of a fanboy of that vehicle because of course I did serve alongside it in the British Army and now transitioned away from the British Army into the Canadian Army. I still have a huge amount of respect for it as a main battle tank. Of course, Challenger 2 progressively being turned into the Challenger 3 soon. Really exciting, I think, for the British Army having a new modern main battle tank brought up to the next generation of tank standards, particularly with, the different targeting systems and even armor package that I've heard are going to get pushed into the Challenger 3. But I think the most prominent is that smoothbore gun, which is changing the ammunition from, older rifled platform to a smoothbore gun, which is going to help, I think, the NATO operations that are going on, particularly that in, of course, Europe right now. But Challenger 2 has a lot of history behind it. I'm not going to go through its entire history. If you want to go check out the actual video of the Challenger 2, I've done many a video on it before. You can go check them out, and I'll put them in the description box. But today I want to talk a little bit about the Challenger 2 in Iraq in 2003. I had the pleasure and the honor of being taught through my basic training at Army Foundation College, Harrogate, by a armoured crew commander of Challenger 2. He was part of the Queen's Royal Lancers. His name was Corporal Emery. Unfortunately, he actually lost his battle with cancer last year. Very, very sad. Probably one of the greatest leaders I've ever met, particularly when I first came into the Reg Force, or the regular force of the British Army at 16 years old. He was an incredible mentor, a bit of a hard charger, and I kind of benchmarked his leadership and his style through a lot of my British Army career. Very sad. Rest in peace to Corporal Emery for sure. He's an amazing person. It's really sad that he did lose his battle with cancer. But when you are trained by someone who's operated on Challenger 2 and has actually just come back from combat in Iraq, because I joined in 2003, 2004, I think it was, 2004. He had so much experience and input about how he worked with Challenger 2, and of course at the time I was wanting to become a tank armoured crewman when I first joined up, and then I transferred over to the REME. I actually wanted to be part of the Royal Tank Regiment, but I transferred because, got to get qualifications and all that good stuff. But it's incredible to hear the stories about how Challenger 2 actually operated in a desert environment and the kind of lessons learned that they had from Operation Telic, which was the British contribution to the Iraq War of that time. But as much as I love Challenger 2 and the good conversations I've had with many operators and users of it, including my own experiences with Challenger 2, for the Iraq War, there was a formidable challenge, pardon the pun, with the tank being operated in such harsh environments of the deserts of Iraq. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. What was it that caused the Challenger 2 to have these issues, and why was it not as amazing as we perceived it to be during this conflict? Because for the media, of course, seeing tanks blowing up other tanks from a NATO standard was very, very prominent in the news coverage of the war. Seeing Challenger 2s engaging buildings, knocking out tanks from afar, even though technically a lot of the tanks in this conflict were taken out by the Air Force well ahead of the Challenger 2s. A lot of stories that I've spoke to of crews were actually of Challenger 2s just shooting at husks that were already dead. But still, the vehicle did perform what it needed to do, but these problems, although not entirely unexpected in the harsh environments of the conflict, really did impact the tank's operational effectiveness and required significant attention from maintenance crews and the British Army back home to get these tanks more ready for the conflicts that it was facing at the time. One of the primary mechanical issues encountered was related to the tank's engine and its power pack. The Challenger 2 is powered by a beautiful Perkins CV12 diesel engine, which, while generally reliable, and I can speak to that a little bit, I've worked on these tanks significantly in the British Army as a mechanic myself, showed a huge amount of vulnerability to the extreme heat and dust of the Iraqi desert. And when I say dust, it is literally like dust, because sand in Iraq is like baby powder. Same for Afghanistan. It used to get stuck to all my gear. Engines hated it. The filters absolutely despised this stuff because it was literally like pouring talcum powder or baby powder into the air intakes of these vehicles and choked them up. And of course, a 1200 horsepower diesel engine doesn't like to have a restriction of airflow when it's running in high temperatures. And of course, the high temperatures themselves led to overheating and necessitating frequent stops for cooling and cleaning out those air filters with airlines, which really slowed down operations and increased the vulnerability of the tank to enemy engagement. For its time, the tank had fairly sophisticated electronics and targeting systems, which also faced a lot of difficulties. The extreme conditions caused failures in the thermal imaging and laser rangefinder equipment, particularly with the sand and dust, which are crucial for the tank's combat performance to engage targets. These technical malfunctions occasionally render the Challenger 2's advanced targeting capabilities completely ineffective, reducing its combat effectiveness and necessitating reliance on manual targeting methods, which basically meant, and I heard this from the horse's mouth of Corporal Emery, was that the guns were basically bore-sighted onto targets, not being able to using the targeting data from the gun, and this caused major issues for the gunners and the commanders alike to actually reliably engage targets, reducing the combat effectiveness of battle groups at the time. Furthermore, the weight of the Challenger 2 at an up-armoured rate of around 68 tons, compared to its standard 50 to 60 ton capabilities, posed additional challenges, pardon the pun. The heavy weight combined with the soft, sandy terrain of Iraq caused a few mobility issues. The tank often struggled in some of the softer ground, leading to instances where it actually became bogged down and required recovery operations, particularly in sort of the boggy, drainage ditches that the tanks try and traverse across between the highways, things like that, and really deep sand. But let's talk a little bit about the operational challenges faced by the crews, not the mechanical or technical side. Of course, these were significant and also multifaceted, reflecting a lot of complexities in modern armoured warfare in very harsh and unforgiving environments, particularly urban environments of that like Basra for the Iraq conflict, because tanks are not really designed to be utilised, particularly the Challenger 2 in the size and configuration which it was really destined for the Cold War in a, built-up city, not good. And the primary operational challenge was the coordination and communication with mixed force units. Challenger 2 crews often operated alongside infantry, artillery and air support units. Of course, another tracked vehicle I was very prominently used to working with was Warrior, and the infantry call signs working alongside Challenger did have some issues with working with the radio system connecting communication between each regiment, which made huge difficulties in trying to get Challenger 2 utilised exactly how they wanted it to do. And of course, in densely built up areas, this made it even more difficult because radios don't like to communicate in between streets and things. It's just the way they operate with the signal strength. And of course, when you don't have good communications in an urban combat environment, this really caused massive issues in terms of being overly cautious to avoid collateral damage because they didn't know whether or not units were around the area, civilians being in the area, and of course casualties to civilians was a very high risk there, and this slowed down operations almost sometimes to a halt, where they required innovative tactics to utilize the tank's communication systems effectively. For instance, it was literally hand signals. There was times where, Corporal Emery was telling me that he would have to shout to the infantry call signs, 10, 15 meters away from him to move up, to move left and right, which to me is kind of cool. It's almost like World War II style tactics, You didn't always have comms with infantry on the ground, and particularly working in an urban environment, we see things like, Fury, where they're checking the town and they're communicating the infantry on the ground. He literally said it was a lot like that, which in our minds, normally in a modern armoured environment, we expect everybody to be hatched down, headsets on, talking to one another in a digitalized age, and it just wasn't the case. The threat of improvised explosive devices, though, and ambushes was the biggest concern for Challenger 2 crews. While the tank's heavy armor provided substantial protection, the constant threat of heavy-duty roadside bombs and hidden explosives necessitated the continuous vigilance and adaptive tactics of the crews. For instance, loaders, utilizing that GPMG on the loader's hatch there, were constantly scanning their arcs when they're not actually maintaining or utilizing the gunner on the 120mm gun, because there's no requirement to load that gun if we're looking at trying to engage infantry around the area and protect the crew from any ambushes from the left or the right or even from behind, which the gunner of course isn't going to see because his field of view on that tank optic is very limited and tunnel vision to the front of the vehicle. So the crews really needed to balance the need for the aggressive action to knock out main battle tanks and heavy targets to also minimize exposure to asymmetric threats in the 360 environment when they're just going on basic patrols, which these tanks were not really designed for, similar to that of Bosnia and Kosovo. Moreover, the psychological strain on crews was really significant. I mean, you're looking at an environment where at any moment you're either going to get blown up by an IED, engaged from an ambush, or potentially even engaged from another tank. You are a big target, unlike the infantry that has a little bit more capability to hide or to disengage from the area. The tank, not so much. If your track's blown off, you're not going anywhere. You can, abandon the vehicle, but of course there's a lot of technicalities that come with that too. And morale and psychological strain on crews at the time for extended deployments really took a toll on the troops, and the heat, intense heat and constant threat of that engagement really took a physical and mental strain on the troops. Maintaining morale in tanks in this environment is very, very tough and really required some very robust leadership. As I had said, Corporal Emery, my commander at the time, very prominent lead, and you can tell from the lessons learned in operating these tanks in these environments how his professionalism really shone through. In terms of logistics, the Challenger 2 also had some really difficult and complex levels of sustainment of getting equipment and hardware and parts and ammunition to the vehicles. The logistic hurdles for supply chain were really parts focused, though, when it came to maintaining the tanks. With a lot of advanced systems and components potentially being shot, blown up, like optics, sights, radios, and even, the anti-IED equipment that was placed on these vehicles, the kind of sort of jamming equipment or pre-sensor equipment, really required a steady supply of specialized parts to remain operational, and the harsh environment of Iraq accelerated that wear and tear, increasing the demand for these parts and replacements. For instance, tracks were consistently needing to be replaced and consistently needing to be ordered because they're running over smaller IDs, blowing off a track. They're losing a lot of coolant because they're having to do power pack changes with the number of replacements they need to do for the engines because of this air intake issue. So all of this supply line and supply chain was stretched very, very thin, particularly in the initial parts of the conflict, and delivering these essential parts to the front line was even more difficult because they're still in engagement, and creating light aid detachments like I was a part of in the REMI, they were even just as much strained to get these vehicles repaired, and the delays left the tanks inoperable for extended periods, leaving some of the operations to the smaller vehicles like the Land Rovers in a wheeled configuration or the Warriors. Fuel also presented a major challenge for the tank. The engines consumed huge amount of diesel, and maintaining that constant supply was very critical. Fuel convoys had to navigate dangerous routes and often under the threat of the same ambushes and IEDs, and securing these supply lines was a continuous effort, requiring coordination between various different military units and implementation of a very robust security measure, including QRF with those Land Rovers, protecting the supply chain to getting to these tanks at the front, because they're spread very thin at the front in their configuration. They're not normally set in an urban environment, and when you start putting vehicles to try and supply in that environment, it gets even more complicated because there's just not as much protection for these vehicles. And to add more complexity, field workshops were really struggling to get the time to field and fix these vehicles. Crews can only repair as much as they have the support of the manpower to do it. Once a tank breaks down, it's a lot of time-consuming and logistically intensive work that they just couldn't keep up with. I spoke to REMI members when I was in the British Army of them deploying to Iraq, and they were basically saying they worked sometimes 4 or 5 days straight with almost zero sleep to try and get these vehicles operational to the tempo of what the British Army was trying to achieve at the time, because again, you don't want tanks hanging around in an urban environment for very long. So to get them rolling again was critical, life and death critical. In terms of the dust migration and trying to get into the various components and equipment, it wasn't just related to the engine and the power pack, which they did eventually find a way of preventing that dust getting in there by installing some skirts actually to the Chobham side armor that kind of created the vortex to go further back behind the intake, but it still was not perfect. And they progressively modified these skirts and the intake system and the filtration systems to flush out this excess debris and dust. But still, for many, many power packs that went into service and into the tanks, they were nuked by this dust. But I do find it interesting how quickly they were able to mitigate the problem, as best as they could anyway, whilst a war was going on. And when they did the trials and, I guess, training ahead of time before going to Iraq and Oman, they started to notice very quickly some of these issues, but they weren't, as prominent there. When they hit the Iraq dust, that's where things really started to get more challenging, and they didn't really push the level of training as hard as they would in a combat environment where they're consistently being utilized almost 24/7. They're not so much being used like that in a training environment. And of course, once the starting line goes off and that dust is flowing, there's not much they can do to just pull over every 10 minutes and change it out like they were in the training environment. So I do appreciate the fact that the British Army knew that there was a problem. They addressed it very quickly. In terms of the communication systems problems, that was inherently, even during my service, a problem. During 2007, 2008, when I was in Afghanistan, we had a number of issues with Bowman, and the communication systems we utilized in Afghanistan, they were not ideal. You're always going to have some form of radio issue, but for the Challenger 2s in Iraq, particularly in Basra and Baghdad, they had some real problems in those urban environments. However, the British were not the only ones having this issue. The Americans did have a number of issues as well, as well as, you know, a number of other issues that their tanks had similar to ours. But in terms of comms, the British Army didn't have a very quick solution or fix to this. It was, as I said, start using the old school method, hand signals, shouting. And I found it quite disappointing, actually, that there wasn't more investment into trying to make radios and comms better for when we went to Afghanistan. And they probably were better. I mean, I didn't serve in Iraq, but from what I was told from serving members at the time when I went to Afghanistan, they did basically say that the Challenger 2's radio systems, similar to that of what was used in the Warriors I had in Afghanistan, were almost identical in their poor capability in the environments they worked in, which I didn't work in an urban environment. I was open terrain, open desert for the most part, the wadis. It still had issues, which is a little concerning. Comms is a big deal. But I think what really set aside all these issues was that Challenger 2 protected its crew. It really had a very robust armor package. Of course, certainly not without its flaws. There's always going to be something that could take out armor. You get a big enough ID, it's going to take it out. But Challenger 2 protected its crews and did what we needed it to do. And I have so much respect for the crews who operate this tank and that still operate this tank. And I can't wait for Challenger 3 to come out. But when we hear of Challenger 2 in Iraq, we always look at the positives and how amazing it did. But there are also some real difficulties it experienced and that the British Army had with it as well. And it's nice to sometimes just analyze that a little bit because it's not always sunshine and rainbows. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you learned a little bit about Challenger 2 and some of the demonstrated issues it had, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Maybe you were a serving member in Challenger 2 in the Iraq conflict. I'd love to hear from you. DM me, please, or send me an email, or just leave a comment in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, leave me a comment in the comment section as well. And of course, the usual YouTube tripe. Hit the like button, click subscribe. I know many of you do it anyway, but just to help me with the algorithm, I'd really appreciate if you could comment and leave me a like. It does help get my content back out there because, of course, with the all restrictions going on with my, country and YouTube, it's a little bit of a challenge. But I appreciate you stopping by on today's video and have a great day. Bye-bye.